It is, first of all, incredibly global. London, Dubai, a few other places are sort of capitals of the shipping business. But the companies are almost all in offshore secrecy jurisdictions. There is a history of Greek ship owners engaging in fraud of various kinds, which goes back a long way. Sure enough, the Brillante Virtuoso on the night of July 5th, 2011, is attacked. David had some doubts about this case. Not a positive theory of what had happened, but very strong suspicions that the story of this pirate attack was not what it seemed. Turned the ignition, drove less than 50 meters, really, for just a few seconds, and was killed by a car bomb that had been placed under his seat. He was never charged with anything in relation to this case and has never been charged with anything anywhere for any reason, to my knowledge.
Welcome to Underworlds from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. My name is Mark Shaw. In today's episode, I talk to Matthew Campbell, who along with his colleague, Kit Chellel, have written the most amazing book called Dead in the Water. And Dead in the Water is the story of a single ship that was ostensibly hijacked by pirates in the Gulf of Aden. However, when a maritime surveyor called David Mockett begins to investigate, all is not what it seems. And the book exposes the most unbelievable level of fraud in the international maritime shipping industry. It really reads like a spy novel, and it traces a number of characters who, subsequent to the death of Mockett, were involved in the investigation. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark.
Matt, the book is about the maritime shipping industry. You call it the world's most secretive industry, and you have this great line that says ships are potentially worth more below the surface of the water than above. And what do you mean by that? I mean, give us a sense of this industry as a whole, the level of fraud or illegality that you think marks it.
Well, shipping is, at the risk of stating the very obvious, an enormous and enormously important industry. If you look around any room you happen to be in, most of what's in there came on a boat. And, this is something we're all thinking about particularly acutely right now, given the discussion about trade and tariffs and just how integrated global supply chains are. And when we talk about global supply chains, we are largely talking about shipping. So, this is an industry that is worth many, many hundreds of billions of dollars every year. However, it's strangely invisible in a funny way. I mean, and I mean that in a very literal sense. London and New York, Tokyo, used to be great port cities. If you go to Canary Wharf in London, you go to the West India Quay, the East India Quay, Canada Water, where ships used to go all over the world. And, same in Lower Manhattan, all the piers. That's all gone. It's all branches of Carluccio's now or whatever it is, because the ships got too big. And so the ports were moved. In the UK, the big port is now out at a place called Felixstowe. And in New York, it went to New Jersey. The sailors disappear in an interesting way. A lot of them were done away with just by automation. The jobs that remained go nowadays overwhelmingly to people from very poor countries, above all the Philippines and a couple of others. And so shipping is just kind of less present, despite being more important than ever for all of us. And, you asked about fraud. One of the interesting things about shipping is it is, first of all, incredibly global. London, Dubai, a few other places are sort of capitals of the shipping business, but the companies are almost all in offshore secrecy jurisdictions, places in the Caribbean or the Marshall Islands. One astonishing fact about shipping that just about blew the top of my skull off when someone told it to me, but is so mundane in the industry that no one even comments on it, is that it is totally routine for a 300-meter long oil tanker or container ship to come into the port of a port in the UK, port of Dubai, port of Singapore, whatever, with an anonymous beneficial owner. So you could be operating one of these huge assets, super high tech, carrying maybe $1 billion worth of goods in the case of a large container ship. And it can be a mystery to port authorities, let alone to, a mere journalist who owns it. I mean, I find that just incredible. And as you can imagine, that creates space for all kinds of bad behavior.
Matthew, talk. Well, the book focuses on a Greek shipping company, and and you discuss the growth, like really interesting for me. I mean, the growth of shipping post-war in Greece. And is there more fraud in the Greek environment, or is this a kind of global phenomena?
There is a lot of fraud and crime in shipping generally. Uh, Greek ship owners are, certainly no country has a monopoly on it. One reason you do see, and if you speak to people in the shipping industry and they're honest, you do see a fair bit of fraud or suspected fraud coming out of the Greek shipping industry, is for the simple, mechanical reason that Greece is the world's most important ship owning nation. So obviously, anything happening in the shipping industry is going to disproportionately involve Greece. That said, there is a history of Greek ship owners engaging in fraud of various kinds, which goes back a long way. That is not at all to impugn every single Greek ship owner. Of course, there are, a majority, hopefully, who are totally honest and above board. But there have been bad actors in Greek shipping again and again over the years. And there are, a few things about Greece that are worth considering. Greece controls something like 15 to 20% of global shipping. So this is a country with a population of 10 or so million. Its other major export is olive oil, and yet somehow has amassed this incredibly dominant position in this crucially important industry. Greek ship owners are exempt from income tax on corporate profits, and that is actually something that is in the Greek constitution. So you get a sense as you learn more about this that ship owners in Greece are incredibly powerful. They are the most important industrialists in a country that does not have a lot of important industrialists. They're incredibly wealthy. And you can, of course, imagine that if some of them want to do things that we might not approve of, they might be able to get away with it.
Matt, the insurance industry itself is also part of the story, and the book is very good on this. And you are clearly talking to people in the industry and sort of whole London Lloyds. What's the interests of the industry, or what to keep some of this hidden, or just to manage each case as it comes?
So the most important hub of the insurance industry generally, and for shipping in particular, is Lloyds of London, which a lot of people listening will have heard of and have kind of a vague idea about, but may misunderstand. I mean, I certainly misunderstood it before I got involved with this case. The most important thing about Lloyd's is it's not an insurer. It has never sold insurance. It never will sell insurance. Lloyd's is a location, both physically in the city of London and nowadays sort of virtually, where actual insurers who are brand names we know, AIG and Prudential and whoever else, uh, come together to buy and sell bits of policies. So Lloyd's is kind of a facilitator. One of the things that Lloyd's facilitates to a really dramatic extent is shipping insurance. And obviously insurance is very important. Ships, even in 2025, ships get into trouble and sink all the time. Containers fall off, hurricanes come along. So no ship owner is going to go to sea without an insurance policy. Um, and there are a lot of cases. And, if you speak to anyone from Lloyd's in a pub after, maybe the second or third drink, they'll start telling you about them. A lot of cases where claims come into the Lloyd's system that everyone involved suspects are fraudulent. Either perhaps the ship was sunk intentionally, perhaps the ship did not contain in its cargo hold what it was said to contain, perhaps there was some other chicanery going on beneath the surface. And the Lloyd's system, collectively, the insurers who do business at Lloyd's then have to make a decision. do we pay this claim or do we deny the claim? And if we deny the claim, what will happen is the ship owner will sue us, or more likely, a shell company representing the ship owner, who may not ever be identified, will sue us. And then we have to be prepared to go to court in London and defend our decision, which is, of course, expensive. It takes a long time. Um, and so the result is that in the vast majority of cases where there are suspect claims, they tend to get paid out. Or what will happen is the Lloyd's syndicate, which is the group of insurers who've covered a particular policy, and we could talk about how Lloyd's works if you want, will just say, well, Mr. Ship Owner, or more likely, Mr. Lawyer for Ship Owner's Shell Company, we've had some difficulties assessing this claim. Why don't we just call it 50% of the insured value and call it a day? And in this scenario, which again, I stress this happens all the time, and I would challenge anyone at Lloyd's to deny it on the record. A very likely fraud has just paid off.
Matt, I mean, that's fascinating. Can you tell us about the story, the single ship that the book centers on? You call it the biggest maritime fraud in history. And won't you pick up in the telling very quickly what Lloyd's did, or how Lloyd's was involved, to sort of link the points you've just made?
Yeah. So the book, Dead in the Water, centers on one central incident, which involves one ship. That ship was an old rust bucket tanker called the Brillante Virtuoso, owned ultimately by a Greek ship owner, which I'm sure we'll get to, 272 meters long, which, believe it or not, does not make it an especially large oil tanker. In the summer of 2011, it was chartered to carry a load of fuel oil from Crimea, actually, to China. So out of the Black Sea, through the Bosporus, through Suez, and then onto the Indian Ocean. And to do that, you pass through what's called the Bab al-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, which is this sort of maritime choke point between Yemen and Somalia. And in 2011, Somali piracy was at its sort of highest level. There were attacks on vessels all the time. This was dangerous. Everyone knew it was dangerous, but commerce continues. Sure enough, the Brillante Virtuoso, on the night of July 5th, 2011, is attacked off the coast of Yemen by gunmen of some kind. In the course of this attack, the crew are taken hostage for a period. And then, for reasons that at the time were somewhat mysterious, there was an explosion and a severe fire. The crew eventually get out of where they were taken hostage, get off the ship, are rescued by the US Navy. The attackers are nowhere to be seen. And the fire consumes the vessel. It's still floating, but it's a wreck, basically. It's a total loss. And the Brillante, like most large vessels, had its insurance at Lloyd's, both for its cargo, about $100 million in its cargo holds worth of fuel oil, and for the vessel itself, which was insured for something around $75 million. So when this occurred, among the first thing that happens is the Lloyd's machinery starts moving, and all these gears start gearing up to process $175 million worth of claims for the virtual destruction of this vessel. Questions, however, begin to get asked. There are people at Lloyd's and elsewhere, one person in particular, who I'm sure we'll get onto, who begin to doubt this story. And so this process at Lloyd's does not proceed as it normally would, and indeed, as it would proceed in most other cases involving suspicious claims.
But it's quite a story, and you tell it so well. We'll get to some of that later. There are one murder and one suspicious death, both UK nationals, a maritime investigator and a lawyer in Yemen, who seem to lose their lives in relationship to the case. Tell us a bit about these two guys, their role in the story, and in fact the rather depressing point that the cases essentially remain unresolved.
The first person in the Lloyd's machinery who began to have doubts about this story was a really remarkable man named David Mockett, who was what's called a surveyor. And there are surveyors in every port in the world. And basically, they are maritime experts. They're often former captains themselves, as David was, who know everything there is to know about ships and shipping. And when there is an accident, and as I said earlier, accidents happen all the time. Ships get into trouble constantly. A surveyor gets called out. Sometimes it's one surveyor for the working for the ship owner, one surveyor working for the ship's insurers, to check it out, take a look at what's gone on, assess the damage, make sure it is being described accurately, and all being well, pay out the claim. So this is exactly what happens if a tree falls on your house and a claims adjuster comes to take a look. It's functionally the same, just with a lot more specialized maritime expertise. David had some doubts about this case, not a positive theory of what had happened, but very strong suspicions that the story of this pirate attack was not what it seemed. He communicated those suspicions to a number of people in the Lloyd's world. He was preparing brief reports, which were then being forwarded around London. Those got out to a lot of people, as you can imagine. And then on July 20th, 2011, about 2 weeks after this attack, David got into his car outside his office. He was living in Yemen at the time, in Aden, turned the ignition, drove less than 50 meters, really, for just a few seconds, and was killed by a car bomb that had been placed under his seat. Initially, this was attributed to Al Qaeda, who were active in Yemen at the time, but certainly the view of just about everyone who seriously investigated this is that it was not Al Qaeda, and in fact, this was related to David's work on the Brillante Virtuoso case. You mentioned a second man, Roger Stokes, also British, also someone who lived in Yemen at the time. He was connected to this only very tangentially. He worked on a small aspect of the Brillante case. He was himself found dead in very mysterious circumstances about a year and a half later, bleeding from a head wound in his apartment. What happened there, I really don't know. No one seems to. There's only one witness, which was his driver, who found him bleeding to death in his apartment. We included Roger Stokes' death in the book, mostly just because it was one of a number of very alarming things that had happened around this case. But in terms of its severity, obviously his death is a tragedy, but it was not on the level of alarm for the people involved as David's being killed was.
While we're talking about David, you clearly had a lot of connection with his wife, Cynthia, I think, and she comes out of the book as a kind of remarkable character who sort of was, I suppose, mistreated by the system. The case is never solved. People don't communicate. And tell us something about her and her role in the story for you as an author.
So Kit and I began working on this story in 2016. We published a long magazine piece for Bloomberg Business Week on it in 2017, and then the book came 5 years after that. So by the time we came to it, David had been murdered about 5 years before. So we obviously never met him. And we had the challenge, and it's a challenge that reporters do encounter from time to time, of trying to build a composite portrait of someone you have never met and will never meet. So, the first thing you do, of course, is you go to the people around him. And so we talked to a number of David's friends, to some cousins, people like that. There was a brother who I eventually tracked down in New Zealand. Cynthia was his widow, very wary of us at the beginning, and I think understandably so. She had experienced this trauma that no one should have to experience. She felt she had been badly let down by the British government, by Lloyd's, by everyone else involved, for having not in her view, adequately investigated David's death, not ever compensated her for her loss. So she was angry and tended to view almost anyone who she wasn't, already acquainted with with, I think, some very justified, if not suspicion, a bit of reluctance. And winning her trust, which I think we did in the end, did take a long time. My co-author Kit, drove down many times to Plymouth, where Cynthia lives. We also benefited from our relationship with two people who became very central to the story we tell in the book. These two private investigators named Richard Veale and Michael Connor. Michael, in particular, had become very close with Cynthia, and when we by the time we convinced Mick, that we were okay, and that we were people he could trust, that went a long way with Cynthia, and she gradually opened up with us, and as a result, we were able to draw both her experience in the book, and also to much more effectively tell the story of her late husband.
But Richard Veale and Michael O'Connor, these two guys sound like fascinating characters. And you say in the book that you had the same challenge you had with Cynthia. You had to set your credentials. You had to persuade them that what you were doing was worthwhile. Tell us something about that, and tell us about these two guys, because they are the key, if you like, good guys in the story.
So Richard and Michael, Mick and Dick, as we call them, are become the central characters of the narrative, certainly in the second half. And they were private investigators who were hired by Lloyd's insurers, a grouping of Lloyd's insurers, to get to the bottom of this case. And that's somewhat unusual because, as I was discussing earlier, often these suspicious claims just get paid out and, brushed under the proverbial carpet. In this case, for reasons that I don't entirely understand, but certainly David Mockett's death played a role. There was a decision at Lloyd's, we need to figure out what happened. So Richard and Michael are hired. They are both ex-London coppers. They both had lengthy careers, particularly Mick, who was really there for a very long time, in the Metropolitan Police. And then, eventually left, as Met Police detectives eventually do, and set themselves up as private investigators. And they're wonderful, funny, warm, but also, cynical, real, they're real London types, of kind of a bygone world. Richard actually grew up in what's now Canary Wharf before it was Canary Wharf. That's a pretty amazing thing to think about, is what a different world he came up in. And the big turn for Kit and I, between this being a long magazine story and this being a book, there was a gap of a couple of years between when we finished the magazine story and began work on the book. Two things happened in that interregnum that convinced us there was more to do here. One was, there were some proceedings in the litigation around this case that threw up a lot of new evidence that we had no idea about. And in fact, we had, even as we were finishing the magazine story, there were unbelievably dramatic things going on that we had no clue about. And those gave a lot more juice to the idea of doing a book. And the other thing we realized was Mick and Dick, who were two people who were kind of in the background of the original story and who we'd spoken to and were, certainly friendly and helpful where they could, but again, a little bit wary of us. We realized it was in many ways a story about them, because we knew that they had become very involved in this case. I always love people who go beyond their brief. And they had absolutely gone beyond their brief. They were convinced they had to get to the bottom of this. And by the time they were done, they spent the better part of a decade on it, with this playing a huge part of their lives. There was also this very intense relationship that they, and particularly Mick, had built with Cynthia Mockett, which we thought was a very powerful thing to write about and know about. So with those two realizations, Kit and I decided, well, there is a book about this, and it is, in large part, certainly in its back half, a book about Mick and Dick and how they worked this case.
Maybe just before we go on to some of the details of how you built the narrative and did the research, just round off the story for us. So Mick and Dick do an investigation. It's targeted at a particular Greek ship owner, businessman. Sort of how does it roll out and conclude?
So Mick and Dick were hired to get to the bottom of this around 2012, 2013. And they do so to the best of their abilities, but they quickly realize that their idea of their mandate and the idea of their clients, the insurers, is somewhat different. They really want to know everything. They want, particularly, to know everything about what happened to David Mockett. They want, for lack of a better word, and at the risk of sounding a bit cliched, they want there to be justice. The interest of the insurers, and I don't necessarily begrudge them this because they're doing their jobs, is to get out of this spending as little money as possible, basically, to knock down this claim they decided was fraudulent at relatively affordable cost and move on. And as time went on, that became a source of some tension. But nonetheless, Richard and Michael did undertake this enormous globe-spanning investigation, tracking down witnesses, finding technical evidence that no one had found before.
Matt, sorry to interrupt. They were
Of course,
not funding it. Lloyd's was funding it, or did they themselves? I mean, as investigators, did they start putting their own resources in? I mean, when you say they went above and beyond, did that include financially?
they were being paid by Lloyd's, certainly. Although in the end, how much they made out of this relative to the amount of time they put in, I'm not sure. I think it's probably the amount of hours they devoted to this is uncountable. I mean, it really came to be something that obsessed both of them. They eventually tracked down in various dramatic ways that we recount in the book some of the key people, including a whistleblower who ultimately came forward and provided decisive information to them. And then there was a trial in London, which occurred in 2019, and ultimately a finding that the Brillante Virtuoso had been destroyed as part of a fraudulent scheme orchestrated by its ultimate owner, who was a Greek shipping tycoon named Marios Iliopoulos. And actually, one of the first things that Richard in particular had to do when he was brought onto this was to figure out who owned the damn thing, because the owner of record of the Brillante Virtuoso was just a shell company. And it took him quite a while and quite a lot of detective work just to get Iliopoulos' name. So, you can imagine how hard it is to do anything in the shipping business if even finding that basic level of information is so difficult.
And just to round this off, the tycoon is found guilty, but in the end serves no time in prison, pays no fine. Is that correct?
He was never charged with anything. So this was a civil case. And Iliopoulos was arrested briefly in London after giving evidence in court. He was quickly let go, left the UK, I presume does not travel to the UK very much, if at all. But he was never charged with anything in relation to this case and has never been charged with anything anywhere for any reason, to my knowledge. And despite this civil finding in the High Court in London that he was responsible for the intentional destruction of this oil tanker, thus triggering over $150 million in insurance claims, he remains a very active Greek ship owner. He now owns a football club in Athens. He's all over social media. And, certainly at the time when we were finishing the book, he was indirectly continuing to get insurance at Lloyd's.
Matt, I have to say, and I read the book twice. Firstly, when it first came out, and then to prepare for the interview a bit faster. It is remarkably well written, and you build this narrative, and you have characters coming in and out, and you've already described some of them. How did you do it, is the first question. Secondly, you sort of hinted that there's some things you haven't included. So did you have to eliminate some material just to keep the narrative moving forward? Just explain, I think, some of the challenges of writing it and indeed doing it so well. This forward momentum is, from my perspective, remarkable.
Kit and I were both first-time authors, so we had to do this. We had to learn this on the job, as it were. And we had the added complication that we got our deal with Penguin on, I think, March 10th of 2020. So, the world was going completely crazy. And, I was sort of clicking refresh on my bank account every 5 minutes to see if the money had hit, because like we didn't know if the banking system was still going to exist the next day. Um, but we the deal survived and we moved forward. And we then had this enormous challenge, which is we can't travel. The way we had conceived of doing this, and certainly the way I've reported, most stories that I've ever done, is you go there, you go to wherever there is, and you sit down with people for as much time as they'll give you. And you get a flavor of sights and sounds and smells, and that's how you write scenes, and that's how you understand people's personalities and their motivations. Well, none of that was possible. So we had this kind of crazy situation where we had to do everything basically on Zoom. We did a few things in person as it became more possible, but an enormous amount of the reporting for the book was done, on Zoom, on the phone. And actually, it turned out that was okay because everybody was at home, everybody was bored, and a lot of people were happy to chat to us for hours and hours, which was very fortunate. So, Kit and I, who are both fairly experienced reporters, just spent the better part of a year accumulating all the information we possibly could. And in this one, we had a corpus of legal documents, which can be great. They're great in terms of giving you a basic timeline of how things occurred. They're great in some cases where, occasionally you get something really amazing. In this case, one of the main issues in this civil litigation in London was that was what happened on the bridge of this vessel on the fateful night. Well, turns out there's a recording, and the recording was entered into evidence with a transcript. So we actually have, down to the second, all the dialogue on the bridge, over something like a 12-hour period. That's pretty amazing if you're trying to write scenes, and you don't usually get that. So, don't get used to it. But then there would be a reference on page 140 of some legal filing to, a report by Mr. So and so about assessing, the identity of the apparent pirates. Well, we've never heard of Mr. So and so. Who's that? And hopefully they have a distinct name. Sometimes they don't. And you spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, trying to figure out if is it this John Smith or that John Smith. But we added a lot of people, some of whom ended up being quite important to our list on the basis of finds like that. And of course, every time you talk to someone, you say, well, okay, who else should I talk to? So we ended up with a list of certainly hundreds of people. You talk to as many of them as you possibly can, as many times as you possibly can. You read every document, turn every page, as the great historian Robert Caro says. Take notes on everything. And then and this I think is a crucial step, put everything into a timeline. So, we have somewhere in the depths of our computers this massive document, which is essentially everything that happened in this case and to the key people involved in over a long period. Like it's, probably a 15-year period. And in some periods, that timeline is almost minute by minute. In others, it is more day by day or week by week. And then you have your story right there. And it's a question of figuring out what to include, what not to include, who's important, who's not. Of course, a big difference between movies and real life, is that in real life, people come in and out of situations. There isn't sort of one hero who you can follow through the whole story. So, Richard and Michael are amazing characters. They ended up being a big part of the book, but they only come in, I think chapter 11 of 25 or so chapters because earlier in the story, they're just not there. And there's nothing you can do about that. That's reality. They weren't involved. And then, Kit and I came up with a structure and started writing. Writing as a collaborating duo, which can be complicated in some ways. I'm currently working on a book now on my own, as is Kit, separately. And that's, it's both easier and harder to write as a pair, but it went fairly smoothly, and we ended up with something that we think is a great story.
Talk about the collaboration with Kit. I mean, this is, you're both doing reporting, you wrote separate pieces, you shared it. I think I suppose the advantage with the collaborator is you're constantly talking, and in that exchange ideas emerge, and in fact you can halve the work, I suppose. I mean, is your relationship held? You're not now both writing individual books because you don't think you could face working together again?
No, not at all. In fact, I talk to Kit several times a week, and he's on everything I do that's serious. He's my first reader, so I send things to him before I send it to anyone else. And no, we had a great collaboration, and in the course of about 3 years, I think we only had one shouting argument, which is probably pretty good. And we have different strengths, I would say. Kit is a sort of British reporter of the old school, which is, they're all out to get you. Trust nobody. Give them the gears. Go at them as hard as you can. And if they don't help you, if I'm allowed to say that. Whereas I'm sort of more of the kill them with kindness approach. And the optimal solution is probably somewhere in the middle, which is where we mutually ended up at the end. And so the way we did the writing was, so we had, a very long phone call. Keep in mind, I was I was and am living in Singapore. Kid is in London, so we were doing this all at an 8-hour time difference. We had a very long phone call where we came up with an outline, essentially a 27 chapter plan. Okay, what happens roughly in each chapter? And then at that point, it was a question of which of us is most comfortable with that material, or which of us did the really key reporting that went into chapter 11 or is going to go into chapter 11. Which of us really wants to write that? We have in the middle of the book, there's kind of an interregnum, which is about the history of insurance fraud, literally going back to the Greeks, which Kit was really, really enthusiastic about writing. And I just said, have at it. That's yours. And so we split it up and ended up with a more or less equal amount of work. And then we each edited each other's work. And then I gave the whole thing a final edit to kind of make sure it was all smooth. And my wife, who knows my writing very well and knows Kit's writing very well, says she can't tell, who initially wrote each chapter, which I think is a good, is probably means we succeeded in having a seamless approach. I have read books with co-authors where you can kind of tell, where you can kind of see where the joints are, and we really wanted to avoid that.
Matt, as I've said, I mean, the phrase I'm using is forward momentum of this book is really very, very good. You sort of, the characters emerge, you want to read the next piece, so as just as a piece of reading, it's a huge achievement. You hint that you left some stuff out, Matt. I mean, you had lots of material. Clearly, not everything can go in. I mean, what is it, sort of pieces that, in retrospect, or that you feel would have added to the story that are not in, or that you had in and then they didn't quite work into the narrative as you were pushing it forward, that you then eliminated?
Well, thank you for being so kind about the book. It's very nice to hear. I think actually your questions are related. So in the book I'm working on, and God willing, about to turn in, we have it's just me. I have a problem of narrative sprawl. There are just tons of characters. I think they're all fascinating, of course. But reader patience is what it is, and you have to be realistic about that. And I was talking to my editor, who's the same person who was the editor on Dead in the Water, and the metaphor we arrived at was, if you go to a dog track and they let the greyhounds go, they have the little dog on the rail that they follow, and you need in a book, in a narrative book, I think, and particularly in a narrative book on a topic that is not immediately, obviously, screamingly important to everybody, you need to kind of keep sight of that little plastic dog on the railing. People need a reason to keep going. And one reason to keep going, or one way to keep them going, is to remove extraneous characters, extraneous scenes. One weakness that I have as a writer is when I spend time in these kind of obscure worlds, like I'm fascinated by people's stories. There was a guy who is a pretty minor character in Dead in the Water who spent the first 2/3 of his career with the British Antarctic Survey. I mean, how cool is that? Like completely amazing, right? I mean, he was in South Georgia or wherever it was. And I wanted like 3 pages on his time in South Georgia. And Kit just said, like, we can't. Like, you're crazy. Like, this is a guy who his importance is he was on one side of an important phone call. And then that's it. He's gone. So, there are a lot of discussions like that. And I was usually the maximalist. And Kit was more the we have to keep things streamlined voice. And he's probably right, of course. So that's, I think, most of what's left out is in that vein.
The book has been out a couple of years now. It's what's been the response to it? Mick and Dick, Greek shipping tycoon. I mean, what has there been any feedback from a general audience, but also from some of the people who appear as sort of central characters in it?
So the general audience feedback has been good. It has been well read. It was well reviewed, which is enormously gratifying. I and Kit, we got a lot of notes from people in the shipping world, people at Lloyd's, or had a lot of conversations with people in that world, saying that they were really glad we did it. And that we had lifted the lid on a world that they knew, but had either never wanted to talk about or had never had the opportunity to kind of reveal in the same way. It doesn't mean these people are, desperate to go denounce their employers, but they were glad someone had, opened up the story in this way. We've had generally good responses from the people who were in the book. I think most of them felt we were fair in how we portrayed them. There was one letter to the FT by someone who I think felt that their role in the story was underplayed, who was a bit nasty about it, but that's okay. And one thing that I found astonishing, however, absolutely astonishing, is that the Lloyd's market corporately, as an organization, the Corporation of Lloyd's, as it's called, has done its best to say absolutely nothing about any of this in public, and would very much like everyone to forget about it.
People were reading the book in Lloyd's, but Lloyd's never responded publicly, is what you're saying. They never responded to your letters, I think you say at the end, requests for comment. There was just silence.
Correct. Yes, nothing. And similarly, Mario Siliopoulos, the Greek ship owner, nothing. And in fact, as we say in the book, we ended up in this kind of Marx Brothers incident where we couriered a letter to what we know is his office. It is his office. And one of the things you have to do when you're seeking comment and someone is, playing hard to get is you need to be able to demonstrate that you did get them a chance to comment and to weigh in. And I got this befuddled call from DHL, a manager at DHL saying, well, the courier is being told there's no one, they've never heard of Mario Siliopoulos at that address. He had testified in court that was his address. So, we ended up in kind of a crazy situation there, but no, he did not respond or really engage at all.
Matt, I mean, you're obviously a very experienced reporter. Changing media world, Is there space still for clearly you're writing another book, so you believe that, but is there space for non-fiction of this sort? What does it achieve in sort of rapid turnover of stories? Is your next book focusing on a big theme like this? You don't need to give away the topic. Just give us your sense of how you read non-fiction yourself. I see books behind you. And your sense of what role you think it plays in a sort of evolving information media world. So a question a bit all over the place, but I think you know what I'm after.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a great believer in this medium. I can talk about my next book. It's about a systematic series of theft of art that ended up, among other places, the stolen goods in the Metropolitan Museum in New York and the homes of various American billionaires. And it's a story that spans from my part of the world, Southeast Asia, right to Manhattan. Not unlike how Dead in the Water spans from Yemen to the city of London. So it's called The Man Who Stole the Gods, and it will be out next year. And so, yes, I am a great believer in this kind of work. I'm lucky enough to be able to do it for a living, which is a rare thing, and I'm incredibly grateful for. I think there is still a demand for it. I mean, books actually still sell pretty well, which I think is interesting, given what's happened to the media more broadly. Publishers have not had anything like the revenue meltdown that has befallen a lot of traditional media organizations. So, people are reading. They are reading largely on paper, which I always find amazing. I sort of think that buying paper books is something that only strange people like me do, but actually, the share of print versus digital versus audio is pretty stable. And it is often said that, oh, people's attention spans have shrunk. Everyone's just on TikTok. No one has the patience for anything longer than a quick dopamine hit. I actually disagree with that profoundly. And the evidence is in fact in some of those new media platforms. The biggest media success of the last decade, whatever you think of him, and there are certainly reasons to think ill of him, is Joe Rogan, who does 3+ hour interviews, which are, listened to or watched by 8 to 10 million people, probably more now, every week. And that's incredible. So, clearly there is an audience out there for things that require more time, more attention, more consideration. There are lots of documentaries that do very well. There are podcast series that do very well. The medium is the way people consume is changing. Clearly a lot of the energy now is with video. And, I would probably be smart to spend more of my time working on video products, but I think there is a demand for real stories, thankfully. It's not all just TikTok, and, long may it remain.
So you have a good set of work still in front of you, Matt. There's plenty of stories out there. That's Matt Campbell, Dead in the Water. If you've read it, you'll know what I mean by what a good story it is. And it also makes some, I think, very important points about the global nature of the shipping industry, fraud and the like. Matt, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and thanks for your candor around various parts of the story. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark.